make more sense for me to give an overview of what we did.
All right.
We identified a variance first, and obviously expecting to see that those amounts should be equal. Our natural question is why and how did this happen? And how do we seek to solve what those variances are?
So the variance between the batch tally worksheets that are known as the risk limiting audit was 1,283, correct?
Yes.
And the images from the scanned ballot images on the Dominion machines at State Farm Arena showed 1,539 batches, correct?
Yes.
And that's a variance of what?
256.
I have to interrupt again. When you talk about the scanned ballot images, do you mean the ones that were produced by the state in this case?
By Fulton County.
By Fulton County.
In response to the court's order from the last hearing.
Okay, so now we have the two sets of data that have been analyzed and compared.
That's correct.
Thank you.
All right, Mr. Sawyer, if we would continue.
So the first obvious thing that we saw in the Secretary of State's RLA data was there were combined batches. In other words, ranges of batches were counted together. In other words, there were more than 100 ballots in these batches, sometimes far more, sometimes in the order of 700 to 800 to 900 in a single batch because of these combined batches. What we found is that there were 24 combined batches, which accounted for 155 individual batches. That only solves part of the variance. In our continued analysis, what we also saw is that there were sequence breaks in the number of ballots or batches there should have been, and there were also batches that were counted more than one time.
Let me stop you there and ask you to explain what you mean by sequence breaks.
Right. Probably a good analogy would be how you reconcile your bank account. You get a bank statement and you have your checkbook, and then down at the bottom of the bank statement, it says the checks, it lists the checks that were cleared. And you might see an asterisk by one, which represents a sequence break. That's an outstanding check that you're not sure what's happened to, but it's going to clear at some other point and has to be accounted for at some certain point. So when we say sequence breaks, we might see batches number 1 through 5, and then the next batch in the data is batch number 25. We want to know what happened between batch 6 and batch 24. That's missing batches of around 20. So that's a large question mark that we had. There were 47 separate sequence breaks, and in that there should have been 174 batches. In essence, from the Secretary of State's risk limiting audit data, there were 174 batches that were missing by virtue of these sequence breaks.
Should that have been apparent to anyone closely reviewing the risk limiting audit?
That should have been readily apparent to anyone who's performing a reconciliation, let alone.
Does that meet the generally accepted standards for accounting and
It contradicts the concepts of completeness and existence and accuracy, as I mentioned earlier, which are foundational.
So those three pillars, completeness, existence, and accuracy, do you have an opinion as to whether or not the absence of 174 batches even comes close to meeting those pillars?
The answer is no. These need to be more fully investigated, and they indicate the possibility that there are missing batches that might not have been counted.
All right. So, you have anything else to say with respect to the sequence breaks?
Not at this time. I'm just giving a summary level. We could get into a lot more detail about sequence breaks within the individual 5 scanners, but we'll keep it at a summary level at this point.
How many batches did you determine were counted at least twice?
Yeah, let me give the criteria for that first. It was based on the scanner number and the batch number. And this is, again, based on data from the Secretary of State's risk limiting audit. For instance, there was the same scanner, batch, and identical number of votes. We identified 9 batches. When there was the same scanner, batch number, but a different number of votes. In other words, they scanned it twice and came up with 2 different counts. There were 15 batches. There was other situations when it was a different scanner and a different batch, but there were the same identical votes for all 3 candidates. There were 5 batches. That is a total of 29 batches with a high level of confidence that appear to have been counted twice based on the Secretary of State's risk limiting audit data.
Does counting batches at least twice violate the principle of one person, one vote?
Yes, sir, it does.
What other observations?
Let's stick to the forensic auditing, okay?
Okay. What other observations did you make, Mr. Sawyer?
I believe that's, in summary, I think that really captures it. What we, in doing this process of filling in the gaps and identifying how many batches there should have been, there really should have been approximately 1,630 batches. We counted 1,659, but if you eliminate the 29 duplicated batches, that leaves you with about 1,630 of theoretical batches that there should have been. When you account for the sequence breaks and back out the duplicate counted batches, and as well as the combined batches into unique, discrete batches.
So what kind of error rate did you conclude based upon these observations from the 2 batches that you, 2 sets of data regarding batches from the risk limiting audit and the scanned ballot images did you determine there to be?
Sure, if we've got 1,630 batches normalized that should have been, and you take away the number from the risk limiting audit, or you've got the difference of 347 batches there. So that's 1 in 5 that we had to essentially correct and make unique individual batches.
And that's about a 21% error rate?
About 21%.
Did you analyze the error rates among those people, the 5, or at least the 5 scanners, to determine if any of those got it right versus duplicates or that resulted in either multiple counting of batches or sequence breaks?
We did a statistical analysis of how many breaks there were for each scanner, and as well as how many batches that represented. Only one of the 5 scanners had 0 breaks, 0 sequence breaks. So 1 out of 5 scanners did the count accurately.
And which scanner was that?
That was scanner number 4 according to our records.
What would best practices have required here?
That none of the scanners would have had any sequence breaks.
And
Or would have been able to readily explain them in the very rare instance that there might have been a few sequence breaks. In total, again, we saw 47 sequence breaks, which represented 174 batches.
are you able to determine, without access to the actual paper envelopes and the paper ballots, how to explain why there is a difference between the 1,630 batches, which should have been versus the risk limiting audit, which showed the number of batches that were actually reported to the Secretary of State of 1,283, resulting in the difference of 347 missing batches.
Sure, yeah. I always follow a process of legitimization about how something can be just reasonable. For instance, the combined batches. I think that can be explained away. While that's probably not a best practice, that explains away a certain number of that variance. The real thing that we're still looking at is why should have there been 1,630 batches and there were only 1,539 images provided? And we've still got sequence breaks. There's a lot that needs to be reconciled. So really, the only way to do a proper reconciliation of these amounts is to go back to the individual unique ballots. And the only way to do that is to find a unique identifier on the original envelope and the original ballot, the hard copy ballots.
What is the importance of the envelopes in terms of doing your audit?
It's my understanding, I think this is based on Mr. Jones' testimony, which I observed, that there is a tracking stamp that is sprayed. I think the word he used in this testimony was sprayed onto the envelope to identify when it was received, and it gives it a unique identifier. Also, it's important that there should also be a one-to-one correlation between the envelopes and the ballots.
Your Honor, that's all I have.
Okay.